Hi everyone, and today I've got a really interesting lens to look at, the new-ish Canon EF 35mm f2 IS USM. This is one of Canon's widest aperture image stabilized lenses, so it's one of the best choices out there for handheld video work. And the 35mm focal length is extremely versatile. It's actually my favourite focal length of all to work with on a full frame camera. 35mm is nicely wide angle, but it's still zoomed in enough to just about give you some emphasis on your subject, making this an ideal walk-around lens for all kinds of uses, maybe even street photography. And if you're using one of Canon's less expensive APS-C cameras, then 35mm is more zoomed in, but still wide enough for a lot of uses. The lens's maximum aperture of f2 lets in a lot of light for work indoors or in the dark. f2 can also give you a nicely out of focus background, although because this is a wide angle lens, you'll have to get fairly close to your subject to see it strongly. You can get 35mm lenses with faster apertures than f2, and most people watching this review will wonder how the lens compares to Sigma's 35mm f1.4, so I promise to give you some thoughts about that towards the end. But still, f2 is just about fast enough for anything you want to throw at it. Let's look at the build quality. As you can see here, it's not exactly small and light, but it certainly won't take up too much room in your camera bag, and it balances nicely on smaller as well as bigger camera bodies. The focus ring is amazingly smooth and well damped, feeling slightly heavy as you turn it, so precise manual focusing is very easy. The autofocus on the lens is very fast and accurate, but it does make an audible whooshing noise, as you can hear here. It would have been better for the lens to have an SDM autofocus motor, especially as it's such a good lens for video work. The big deal on this lens is image stabilization. Here's some footage on a full frame camera with image stabilization turned off, and now turned on. As you can see, it goes from being slightly shaky to completely still. The difference is much bigger on an APS-C camera though. Without image stabilization, things are pretty shaky, as you can see here. With it turned on, the image is nice and still, and the lens can handle moving around quite smoothly. So it's much more useful if you're using an APS-C camera. The image stabilization makes a gentle clicking noise in use, so video makers might want to use an external microphone with their camera. Okay, let's look at the all-important picture quality. Firstly, I'll test the lens on a 20 megapixel Canon 6D, a full-frame camera. I'm testing the lens with peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction turned on. With the aperture wide open at f2, we see very good sharpness in the middle of the image, although some other lenses are a little sharper. Sharpness is holding up fairly well as we look in the corners of the image, although some gentle ghosting can be seen on contrasting edges, and the contrast levels are a bit weak compared to the middle of the image. However, when we stop down to f2.8, the sharpness and contrast levels get a really good boost, and picture quality in the middle of the frame has become absolutely perfect. At f4, the lens is just as good in the middle, and the corners have sharpened up a little more, becoming perfectly sharp at f5.6. So overall, the lens gives a good performance with the aperture wide open at f2, but the picture quality becomes much more lively as soon as you stop down a little. Okay, let's look at the lens's performance on an APS-C camera, in this case my 18 megapixel Canon 6DD. Picture quality in the middle of the lens is nice and sharp, although I think the contrast levels could be very slightly higher. As we look into the corners, the image quality holds up fairly well, although we are seeing a slight softness and slight chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. Here you can see it in the window frames. When you stop the lens down to f2.8, there's a very nice improvement in sharpness and contrast, and the chromatic aberration has cleared up. At f4, the corners become very sharp indeed, and the middle of the image is fantastic too. So on an APS-C camera, it's much the same story. At f2, the lens doesn't blow you away, but the picture quality is certainly pretty good, and it really comes to life as soon as you stop it down to f2.8. Well, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting. It's not really an issue on APS-C cameras, so I've tested it on a Canon 6D again. As you can see, there's mild barrel distortion, but nothing to really worry about. However, at f2, there is some strong vignetting. Those corners are pretty dark. However, if you turn on peripheral illumination on your camera, it's no longer a problem. All in all, the lens is doing okay here. The 35mm f2 is certainly not a macro lens, but it can focus closely enough to your subjects to get some suitably fun pictures. Here you can see that the close-up picture quality is quite good, becoming nicely sharp at f2.8. As you can see in this footage, the lens works pretty well against bright lights. We see a little flaring, but not too much lack of contrast. Seeing as I'm pointing the thing right at the sun here, that's not too bad. An image-stabilized f2 lens begs to be used at nighttime, and it's a lot of fun to use after dark. But one issue with this lens is that it suffers from strong coma levels in the corners of the image, and this causes bright points of light to look smudgy, which is a real shame. This is something that the Sigma 35mm f1.4 lens handles a bit better. Another important aspect of the lens is the quality of its bokeh, or the out-of-focus backgrounds. Here you can see that those backgrounds, thankfully, look nice and softly rendered in a way that's undistracting. As you can see in this video footage, points of light are presented nice and softly without any annoying highlighting or busyness. It's only with very complex backgrounds that we see any messiness, but it's rarely an issue. At the end of the day, the Canon 35mm f2 IS USM is a unique lens which is a lot of fun to use. It's especially useful for video work, and especially on an APS-C camera where the image stabilization is even more helpful. The image quality at f2 is not perfect, but it's good enough, and the lens is extremely sharp when you stop it down even just a little. But let's address the elephant in the room. The Canon 35mm f2 IS USM is a slightly tragic lens because it will always reside under the shadow of Sigma's amazing new 35mm f1.4, which I reviewed a little while ago, where it blew me away. Let's try to make sense of them both and see if there's clearly one you should buy. Firstly, and most obviously, the Sigma lens can let in twice as much light. That's a big deal. You could really use f1.4 to get some snappy indoor photos. Also, it'll give you backgrounds which are twice as blurry, which is a big advantage. The Canon lens's big selling point here is image stabilization, although for a wide-angle lens on a full-frame camera, that's not the biggest deal in the world. It's very useful for video work though. The Canon lens has slightly faster autofocus, but the Sigma lens is considerably quieter. They're both very accurate. The Canon lens has to deal with very annoying levels of coma, and the Sigma does better there. The Sigma lens, I think, is sharper than the Canon, with slightly better contrast, although by the time you stop down to f2.8, they're both pretty much the same. The Sigma lens is bigger and heavier, the Canon being more portable. At the time of this review, also, the Sigma lens is a little more expensive. Overall, I think that most people will actually slightly prefer the Sigma lens, not because there's anything really wrong with a Canon lens, but because the Sigma is just so incredible. I think the people most interested in a Canon lens will be people shooting video on an APS-C camera. It's not an easy decision to make, as image stabilization is valuable, but the Canon 35mm f2 IS USM is simply a great lens, which I can highly recommend.